to our town hall on the Fix Congress First plan. Let me put this town hall into perspective by looking from where we've been. When I was elected to the city council and the city was on the brink of bankruptcy, I turned to those politicians and the bureaucrats at City Hall who said our only way to solve the problem is to raise taxes and gut services. I said, no, there's a third way, and that's rethinking how our government operates, becoming more efficient and more accountable for the money that we currently spend. And I knew that if we posed this challenge to San Diegans of how do you reform the city's budget, how can we do more with less, that San Diegans would have a lot of great ideas. And so we took a series of town halls and we went around the city to every single neighborhood and we presented the problem and asked people for feedback and ideas. And on the basis of that, we built the 360-page roadmap to recovery plan that balanced the city's budget without tax increases and had money left over to restore services. And we were able to get that reform done because we involved the people in formulating the ideas and then, of course, ultimately putting pressure on the politicians to act. I believe that the same is going to have to happen if we're going to fix the problems in Washington. And one of the first things I think we need to address is the broken system in Congress. You look at Washington today, and you see dysfunction, you see infighting, you see political posturing. You don't see a whole lot of solutions. You don't see a whole lot of focus on getting things done. And I think that if we're going to get better results from Washington, we have to start by fixing Congress first. Congress is broken. They're not doing their jobs. They're not in touch with the problems of the American people. They don't live under the same rules that the rest of us do. And that's why we have to start there if we're going to get any sort of progress on some of the other issues, whether it's the economy or the federal budget or fixing broken programs in each of the federal departments. And so it's a very simple concept. Let's require that the U.S. Congress live under the same rules as the rest of us. No more special exemptions. Time and time again, you see Congress voting on laws, telling us what to do, imposing mandates and burdens on us, limiting our freedom. Then they turn around and quietly sneak in exemptions for themselves. And when you look at what members of Congress get in terms of special privileges and perks, it's nauseating. And it's no surprise that members of Congress from both political parties have demonstrated the lack of responsiveness and empathy for what's really happening to American families and the struggles that we face. So let's require that they start living under the same sorts of forces, same sorts of laws as the rest of us. And so when we look at our Fix Congress First plan, it starts with that basic concept. Eliminate the special exemptions. And when you take a look at some of the laws that Congress has exempted itself from, it's really shocking. They pass Obamacare, they turn right around and find a way to give themselves an exemption, to get a massive taxpayer subsidy for their health insurance. They have eliminated the standards for whistleblower protections when it comes to Congress. And again, when you take a look at what's going on in Congress and some of the self-dealing, wouldn't it be nice to know that if a whistleblower saw what was going on, if they stepped forward and spoke truth to power, they would be given protections? Freedom of Information Act, this is near and dear to my heart. I'm a big believer in open government. That citizens should be able to go to government agencies and say, you just decided to approve that development project. I want to see every email, every bit of correspondence that you had with the various interest groups that are going to benefit. Under the state of California, we have a law, the Brown Act, that allows us as citizens at any time to go in and ask for the records. In pension reform, this was a huge thing. Open government was huge in getting the case built for the pension crisis. We went in and we said, how much are these government workers getting in pensions? And at first they said, oh, that's confidential, we can't tell you. It's secret. We said, that's not confidential, that's public money. We have a right to know. And so we actually, in San Diego, won a court case against the retirement system to force them to open up their books. And as a result, we found things like a librarian getting a $234,000 a year pension. So Freedom of Information Act is applied to all of the federal government departments. Right now, you can send a letter to the Department of Agriculture or the Department of Education, and you can say, I want any documents relating to this issue, and they have to give you those documents. You know what one federal organization is exempt from this law? Congress. Cannot ask for their documents. They have no requirement to hand over their documents. You know, a lot of our working business, small business owners, continue to complain about the various mandates and burdens applied to them. And there's always this balance, because you want to make sure that we protect our workers. You want to make sure that there are safe and healthy environments for people to work in. But you also want to know that the regulations are fairly and properly implemented. Congress has exempted itself from the various regulations and rules on worker rights and occupational safety. And then, of course, an issue that we just experienced here in San Diego, sexual harassment training. There is a law called the No Fear Act, and that requires that every federal manager shall undergo sexual harassment training. Now, it's important not only to make sure that the individual knows the sort of conduct that they should engage in, what's permissible, but it's also important to train people on what they're obligated to report if they see another manager engaged in that sort of behavior. So this training is important not just to tell people to keep your hands to yourself, but it's also important to raise awareness in the workplace. Well, who claimed that taxpayers should have to pick up the tab for the lawsuits? Bob Filler. He said that because he received no training on sexual harassment, that you, the taxpayer, are on the hook for all the millions of dollars in legal fees and lawsuit liabilities. And this is from the Union Tribune back in July of 2013. Members of Congress are not required to abide by their own law, the No Fear Act. Again, just one example of bad behavior and, of course, the associated legal liability and cost to taxpayers from these special exemptions. So we're going to start out by requiring every law that has been passed by Congress shall immediately be applied in full, fully enforced to members of Congress themselves. Next reform relates to no budget, no pay. You know, out of the last 10 years, all but I think maybe 2 years, Congress has failed to pass a budget. We saw several years where the Senate just decided to skip introducing and passing and voting on a budget. We face a national debt crisis. And part of the solution to the national debt crisis is to fix the broken budget process so that we get the budgets passed on time, that there's proper oversight, and that we are holding members of Congress accountable, not just putting our government on autopilot and letting the spending go on autopilot. So I am a big believer in the no budget, no pay, for real. I've had to add those words because the politicians are trying to sell some snake oil right now. Scott Peters campaigned on no budget, no pay. But then when he got to Congress, he turned around and passed a phony version and then patted himself on the back saying he did it. Guess what? That version only requires that a resolution be passed in each individual chamber. It does not require that the budget be passed. It does not require that the 13 appropriation bills be passed by both chambers and signed by the president. And so if you don't get your spending bills passed, the government shuts down, in whole or in part. No budget, no pay for real. And by the way, their no budget, no pay symbolic resolution only lasted for 1 year. It also allowed members of Congress during the government shutdown to continue to be paid, and members were allowed to catch up on payments for their salary. Under our requirement, you don't do your job, it's not a delay in your payment for your salary. You forfeit in full, permanently, your salary for every single day that the Congress fails to pass a budget. And so this is important in holding the members of Congress accountable to actually work together to do their job and pass perhaps one of the most important pieces of legislation each year, which is the budget on time. And so what we've decided to do is introduce a no budget, no pay mandate that doesn't just apply to members of Congress, it also applies to the political appointees in the White House. And there are thousands of political appointees in the White House and the executive branch. So members of Congress and the White House political appointees would forfeit pay. And this will significantly reduce the chances of a government shutdown. It'll allow them to work together to pass a budget on time. So another reform that we're going to look at is, going forward, eliminate the pensions and special health care subsidies and other perks for members of Congress. Members of Congress voted themselves a lavish pension system. And what I'm proposing is that, just like we did here in San Diego with the pension reform initiative that all of you helped with, we are going to require that members of Congress receive a retirement allowance that's no better and no worse than the American people who are footing the bill. Members of Congress will be placed in Social Security and they will be given a modest 401k match of just 3%, which is the national average of employers in this country for 401k. We are benchmarking it to no better, no worse than what the American people themselves receive. We're going to eliminate the double dippers. This is a group of people, and my opponent Scott Peters is one of the double dippers. These are members of Congress who are getting a full salary, and they're taking a government-funded pension. So they walk in taking a pension from the taxpayer, and they get a full salary. What we would require is that if you walk in with a government-funded pension from prior elected service, you would have a salary that is reduced by a commensurate amount. So you're being paid by the taxpayers to be a member of Congress, but you're not able to double dip. And I saw this in San Diego where we had members of the city council, like my opponent, able to draw their retirement in their 40s. Can you imagine starting to get your pension in your 40s? Well, these politicians here voted themselves a zero retirement age. So our youngest retiree was actually 32 years old. A former city council member at age 32, starting to receive a pension from the taxpayers that was greater than the average of what the Social Security recipient receives in this country. At age 32, for goodness sakes. And then you looked at all these other politicians earning in their 40s. One of them was earning $100,000 a year in their 40s in government pension payouts. And then, of course, they go on to other elected positions in government. So we're going to eliminate the double dippers. We're also going to, under health care, eliminate the Obamacare subsidies. And here's a novel concept. We're worried about the solvency of Medicare and Social Security. I think members of Congress would be more likely to be interested in the long-term solvency of Medicare and Social Security if that was the system that they themselves had to live under. And so we would require that they are enrolled in the Medicare program, but they would be required to pay a contribution, a copay for their health coverage that's benchmarked again against the national average. Banning free travel. I found out by looking at some of the records that in August alone this past year, which is the recess period for Congress, members of Congress took $1.7 million in free junkets around the country. And remember Bob Filner going to Paris? He took these junkets, and then when he went to the city of San Diego, under state rules, he violated the state rules. And so we were on the hook for the travel here. And so what we would require is that that free travel be banned. And we would allow for fact-finding missions and legitimate oversight, but we would hold members of Congress accountable by actually having to vote to receive any sort of nonprofit subsidy on their travel. They would have to say, yeah, there's a legitimate purpose and I'm willing to cast a vote and stand by that vote. Accountability. We also see members of Congress use a loophole under campaign finance rules. They don't have to report, nor is there a prohibition on golf outings and special trips and hotel stays if they can claim that that travel is related somehow to campaigning. And so we would require that every member of Congress publicly disclose the aggregate amount of gifts that they are taking through this campaign loophole so that the public knows what they're getting, where they're getting it, and whether it's appropriate. Fourth reform, open government. We would not only apply the open government rules to Congress, but we would set up a special inspector general function in the ethics committee to enforce and handle all records requests. Again, Bob Filner is my perfect example. He basically ignored public records requests from the media and from members of the public. We're going to take compliance out of the hands of the members. No self-policing. It will be an ethics committee division that takes all of the public records requests and goes and searches the database and the files to make sure that the public gets the right to know, they get all the documents they're requesting. The fifth reform relates to single subject and read the bill first. These two rules, I know, that we even have to actually talk about this, it's crazy. But the single subject and read the bill rules relate to two requirements that the Congress will have to meet before it votes on a piece of legislation. The first one is the transparency requirement. In fact, just this week, they voted on a 1,600-page bill, 1,600 pages. And they only provided, I think it was a day and a half for people to actually review it. That actually is more than most bills. Some bills are not, the full text is not known until it's actually the day of. Sometimes they're voting at midnight, so not a whole lot of people are paying attention. We would require that every piece of legislation be posted online and any amendments that are being considered. So you can't walk on the House floor suddenly and say, I'm going to change some words here, unless you posted your amendment 72 hours in advance for the public to see it and weigh in. A gentleman came up to me at this town hall. Where are you? There we go. This is a perfect example of the value of these town halls. He said, don't just require them to post it online. Have every member of Congress certify for every piece of legislation under the penalty of perjury that they have actually read the legislation before they vote on it. I think that's a great idea. Second, require a single subject rule. So you have these must-pass pieces of legislation that people say we've got to vote on this bill or else it expires. And then the special interests look at the must-pass pieces of legislation. They say, ooh, let's light this one up like a Christmas tree. Let's add all sorts of unrelated amendments for the special interests. And then because it's a must-vote legislation, we can sneak our provisions through. And that's where, for example, in the debt bill, they added a special tax subsidy for windmills. Again, it may be great to have that subsidy. Again, we can have a debate on that. But it shouldn't be applied to a bill that is unrelated. We want to make sure that legislation deals with one subject so that none of this extra monkey business is added to the end of a piece of legislation. Now, I was asked the other day by a reporter when we rolled this out, you know, this is not going to go over well in Washington.
No.
And I said, I know. I'm fully expecting a whole lot of opposition from career politicians because guess what? We're sending a message with this that the gravy train has ended. But isn't this the same type of opposition we faced on pension reform?
Absolutely.
When we first raised this issue, the politicians, the government union said, no, you can't touch these pensions. And we kept chipping away and we kept building a public grassroots movement for reform. And guess what? We got it done in San Diego. And now we're taking that same model around the country. I have about 2, 3, 4 phone calls a week from elected officials from around the country who are interested in pension reform, but one of their key questions is, I don't think this is politically doable. There's so much that we're going to be facing in terms of opposition. And I said, no, you can do it. We did it in San Diego. We did it in San Jose. You can do it in your jurisdiction. And so I refuse to limit our reforms just because the politicians are going to feel uncomfortable. You know what? It's time to light a little fire and hold them accountable. They'll see the light once the heat gets hot enough. And you're the heat. The public is going to be the heat. So I know that this is not going to be easy. I know that it's not going to happen overnight. But these are things that if the American people had a direct vote on these reforms, they have passed overwhelmingly, 90%.